To my right here is Ivan Penn. Ivan is a correspondent for the New York Times who covers energy issues related to the electric grid, renewables, electrification of the transportation sector, and those who regulate the industry. His numerous awards and honors include the John S. Knight Fellowship at Stanford University and the prestigious Gerald Loeb Award from the UCLA School of Management. Penn also founded and has served for the last 4 years as president of the Power of Song Incorporated, a nonprofit organization that educates youth and communities about social justice issues through song, theater, and art. And he had to choose between being a professional trumpet player and being a journalist, and he chose journalism. So, and then next over is Stephen Hayward. He's currently senior resident scholar at the Institute of Government Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, a visiting lecturer at Berkeley Law, and a senior fellow with the Bipartisan Policy Center. He was previously the Ronald Reagan Distinguished Visiting Professor at Pepperdine University's Graduate School of Public Policy, and he was the inaugural visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at the University of Colorado, Boulder. He's the author of 6 books, including a 2-volume chronicle of Ronald Reagan. And as the token conservative at UC Berkeley, he will be going into the witness protection program after his career is over. So finally, we have Alexander Verbeek, who is a Dutch environmentalist, public speaker, diplomat, and former strategic policy advisor at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Over the past 29 years, he has worked on international security, humanitarian and geopolitical risk issues, and the linkage to the Earth's accelerating environmental crisis. And Alexander is a photographer in his spare time. So I'll begin with Ivan. Ivan, can you tell us a little bit about climate change innovation, please?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you today. And I was thinking about this subject in terms of the work that I do. So as was mentioned, I cover the power sector for the New York Times. And one of the questions that stays in front of my mind is, what are we missing, particularly in regard to innovations? Early in my time at the New York Times, which has now been a little over a year, I was at the LA Times prior to that, also as an energy correspondent. I wrote a story about a proposal at Hoover Dam. An engineer at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power had an idea to turn Hoover Dam into a pump storage facility. The purpose was to take all of the excess solar and wind that wasn't being used and to store it. And when you think about the idea of turning Hoover Dam into a giant battery, it was an innovative idea, but then also you're looking at the question of, is this just an engineer with pie in the sky thinking? When we looked at it and looked at what the proposal was, we saw that there was an opportunity here, and as I listened to the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, something simple as basically sticking a straw downstream and putting a motor on it and pumping water back into Lake Mead behind Hoover Dam. Simple, low-tech, and if you know how pump hydro works, in a hydro plant, a general hydroelectric plant like Hoover Dam, the water rolls down, spins a turbine, produces electricity. In a pumped hydro, there's a reservoir below the dam, and they use power from some source to spin the turbine backward, and it sucks the water back up. So instead of retrofitting Hoover Dam, it was just literally sticking a straw downstream and pumping the water back behind the dam. And when I thought about it, I was like, wow. So now you can take the power of Hoover Dam, which generally operates at about 25% of its capacity right now, and raise that to as much as 45%. And increase the amount of solar and wind that you are deploying, particularly in the desert areas in Nevada and California, and power that pump as a storage unit. It's like, what other innovations out there are right in front of our faces? We're looking for a lot of complex solutions, but some of them are as simple as a straw. And then in another case, I was contacted about a story also about storage. And for those in this energy space, storage is considered the holy grail of the energy sector. As we increasingly solve storage, then we can really begin to deal with managing our energy and also dealing with the effects of carbon. So I was approached by someone who said, hey, there's this idea about an alternative battery to lithium, and it was zinc. Not a new idea, just like the hydro plant, not a pump storage, not a new idea, but Thomas Edison had not figured out how to make a zinc battery that was effective. The trouble was that the battery wouldn't recycle, so they've been working on this idea for 100 years, since Thomas Edison. Over the last 6 or 7 years, billionaire Patrick Soon-Shiong, part owner of the Lakers, now an owner of the Los Angeles Times, his company, NAN Energy, developed a Zinc Air Battery that's already coming in at a price point lower than lithium. And it lasts longer. Now, zinc is healthier, quote unquote, than lithium. We all need it to live. It's much more plentiful than lithium. And from his perspective, you know, since we have to use it to live, then this is a good way to deal with all of the issues that we're dealing with in terms of storage. And it proved effective. Now the question is, can he deploy it, scale it on a level that's effective? So what I began to see was that there are a lot of ideas out there. Now, of course, the problem with zinc is you still got to mine it, and mining of anything is a challenge. But those were two major examples of where we're seeing innovations that are taking place, and some of them are in front of our faces. Some of them have lesser health effects than things that we're already using. The question is, what else is out there?
Great, thank you, Ivan. Stephen, how about you? What do you think about climate change innovation?
So I'm glad the panel is called Climate Change Innovation instead of just energy innovation. It's not our topic, but I'll just assert that one of the problems with this whole area is that climate policy has been wrong-headed from the very beginning 30 years ago with its overemphasis on near-term hydrocarbon suppression. For example, why I think that, if cement was a country instead of just a sidewalk, it would be the third or fourth leading emitter of carbon dioxide in the world. And by the way, when you say cement, that's kind of a proxy for China, because over a recent 10-year period, Václav Smil, who was a very interesting guy up in Canada at the University of Manitoba, calculated China poured more concrete in a recent 10-year period than the United States did in the entire 20th century. So one of the things for an entrepreneur, for our research labs is, and there's been some work on this, is to see if we can figure out low carbon cement. And I've followed a little of this, I've read a few of the technical papers. Like many things, you can do it in the laboratory, but there's always the problem of cost and scale and resource constraints and whether you get a positive energy balance and greenhouse gas emission trade-off at the end that makes it work. But there you go. That's we think of coal-fired power plants and oil and natural gas, and we leave cement behind. Just as one example. The other thing is, whenever you think about some of the alternative energy menus that we might want to adopt, I think I'll do it this way. The dimensions of the decarbonization challenge are not very well appreciated. And one problem with this whole field is we use what I call MIGO numbers. My eyes glaze over. You'll hear 50 gigawatts of this and 100 megawatts of that, and 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and on and on. So I did some calculations that, and I don't have time to go through them, but if the US is going to make the target of 80, 90% decarbonization by the year 2050. That's always been one target year. It means we have to lower our per capita emissions to about 2.5 tons per person. We're at about 16, 17 now, down from a peak of 20, by the way, a few years ago. So 2.5 tons per person, that's still an abstract number. What does that mean? Well, there are a few countries today that have greenhouse gas emissions at 2.5 tons per person. The list includes Haiti, Somalia, Jordan, interestingly enough. What do they have in common? They're really poor countries. You did a long deep dive in the data. The last time the US had greenhouse gas emissions of really burning wood and fuel oil in the 19th century, whale oil, let's remember, about 1870. Before we had any cars and trucks and trains, or not many trains and airplanes and all the rest. Before we started really heavily industrializing. So in other words, you're talking about complete decarbonization. I'm not entirely certain, by the way, that we even emitted 2.5 tons per capita in 1776, when all we burned was wood. So that's the scale of the challenge. Now, to make a long story short, the ideal solution would be to electrify everything, ideally from a solar panel, because electricity is really the best and most efficient form of end-use energy from an engineering point of view. And one of the problems is storing it. It's hard to store electricity. Our batteries, the existing technology, it's getting better, the price is coming down, but it's not very good. And the biggest problem is there's a supply constraint. So either zinc or lithium, some of the calculations are, if we went today to batteries in the entire world's surface fleet of cars and trucks, we'd exhaust our lithium supply in about 50 years. And by the way, you hinted at this, Ivan, that the environmental impact of the full supply chain for lithium or zinc or any of those finite resources is considerable. Not just the mining directly, but the manufacture of the batteries. It's a very high carbon footprint. So the end use of the battery, that's great, but the total life cycle cost impact of that is really very high. I assert, without being able to establish it here, that we're going to need for a very long time to make electricity work well, a lot of old-fashioned, big, dispatchable sources of energy that will need to replace coal and gas and so forth in the fullness of time. So the first thing I think of is nuclear. We've been trying to get this revived and it's not going well. But a couple of numbers for you about where we are. By the way, every number I'm about to give you will probably be wrong, because one of the frustrations of this area is that there's always different sources and they all differ with each other a little bit the way they count what the estimates are. But here's one. There are about 44 nuclear reactors under construction around the world right now, totaling about 50 gigawatts. They'll come online in the next 4 or 5 years. 12 of those are in China. 50 gigawatts is the peak consumption of California on the hottest days of the summer. So in other words, we're going to add a capacity of California's needs over the next few years. We're doing 2 reactors in this country that bankrupted Westinghouse again. But so 50 gigawatts, okay, that's good. Right now, and China's got a lot more on the drawing board, right now China has under construction 259 gigawatts of new coal plants. What does that mean? Another MIGO number. That is more than the entire existing coal fleet that we still have in the United States, on top of 900 gigawatts that China has already got going, right? So let's give us some of the scale of the difficulty. I'm over time a little bit. I've toured the Max Planck Institute Fusion Lab in Germany. I've toured the Princeton Lab here. Lawrence Livermore's up the hill from me. And fusion power, it's been 10 years away for the last 50 years. Maybe one day we'll get it right. 5 years ago, Lockheed Martin said, we made a breakthrough. And I've heard nothing since. Energy journalism is something that's always been very frustrating to me. Maybe we can talk about this a little bit. Finally, sorry, I'm going on too long. Finally, the idea of air capture, which is maybe we can actually suck the carbon dioxide out of the air. Lots of lab experiments on this, difficulties scaling it up, but that's a research area that needs to be pursued. And so that's my opening.
Great. Thank you, Stephen, very much. Alexander, what are your thoughts on climate change innovation?
I think to solve climate change, we basically need 2 things. You need governance and you need technology. And being a former diplomat, normally the governance makes me pretty sad because it is so difficult to solve this challenge. But look at technology, that always makes me happy, because the the progress of innovation that we have seen, that's remarkable. I mean, think about electric vehicles, for instance. Try to go back 10 years ago. Did you realistically think that you would ever drive an electric vehicle? And now, soon, your next car is probably an electric vehicle, right? The progress in batteries, etc., that was mentioned. That is often a positive story. The sad thing is you need both. You need good governance and you need innovation, and the two of them are often linked. You, as a government, you need to make it possible. You need to stimulate that you have innovation, that you have research, development, that you have good governance. So the answer lies both at governance as well as in the industry. And if you look at the industry, there are so many positive examples that can inspire. If you look, for instance, at, I mean, take a company like Unilever, huge multinational, working commercially, making good profits, but they have in the past 10 years or so completely turned around the way that they produce their things. And the fun thing is that whenever they try something new, it turns out at the end it gives them more profit. So let's take something simple as the packaging of your goods. If you decide we want to use less packaging, you need less material, cost you less money, you have to transport less material, you have to produce less material, then it takes you less time to wrap it up in your packaging, and afterwards you have less waste. So it saves you money and it's good for the environment as well. And there's a lot of this kind of low-hanging fruit, which is just changing the way you organize things, and you already become sustainable. And that brings us to a completely new kind of economy. If you can make the economy more circular by being creative and innovative, you can really do so much to help the climate. So let's give the example. I was flying here. Flying is not a good example, talking about sustainability. I was flying here from Schiphol Airport, and the lighting in the new lounge there is provided by Philips. The way it used to be, if you had like an airport and you want to have lights there, is that the airport buys whatever light bulbs, and that provides the light. So you buy the product light from Philips, Netherlands, the biggest light bulb industry, of course. So what changed now is that Schiphol is no longer buying the product light bulb, but the service light. So Philips becomes a service provider, and the service they provide is they say, we will provide so much light for you. Well, the next thing that happens is, first of all, it's good for Schiphol because they don't have to make the upfront investment in light bulbs. They only get a bill afterwards, like you have for all your services. What Philips does, being responsible for this service, they use the newest generation of LED lights, which is twice as effective as the previous one. So the use of electricity is reduced by half. Then Philips is responsible for this light, so they remain responsible. It's not that they once produced a product and then it's your problem, it remains their problem. So they design these light elements in such a way that they can easily be reused or remade or recycled. You can pick out those elements that you can still use for the next light. So the amount of products and energy put into it is much more effective. So at the end of the day, who wins? Well, Schiphol Airport, because they pay only half the energy and they don't have to make the investment. Philips wins because they got lucrative contracts, and the environment wins because there's less pollution. So this kind of creativity, that makes me very happy because I see so many of those examples. You can talk about innovation in climate change in all kinds of related challenges like water and food, energy was already mentioned. And in all of these fields, there are so many possibilities. And I see it as a task of the government to stimulate that this kind of innovation takes place. That means, for instance, stop your subsidies on fossil fuels. Worldwide, there are 6 times as much subsidies on fossil fuels than on renewable energy. That doesn't make sense. The thing that's killing us, climate change, this existential threat, should not be subsidized. It should be tackled in a cooperation between the corporations as well as governance. I was puzzled as well as surprised by your 1870 calculation. I would love to do it again with you afterwards. The number that I use, but it's in a way also a massive challenge. If you look at the latest IPCC report, it says if we want to remain at an amount of heating of our planet that is kind of sustainable, we have to roughly reduce by half our emissions in this world in just 11 years' time. So it is a massive challenge, but it's not a reason not to do it. Even if we can't make it, it's still better to live, let's say, in a 3-degree world than in a 4-degree world. So it's a duty for all of us. And the good thing is that if you tackle a challenge like this, you are working together and are forced to innovate. Let me, as a last remark, let's take the parallel with the Second World War. Nobody was happy about, that we had to solve the Second World War, like that we're not happy that we have to solve climate change. But if you look at that period, how by changing the way both government and industry worked, how much was available. At the end of the war, I think a Liberty ship was produced every 5 hours. There was an enormous innovation in healthcare. You got penicillin, you got all kinds of new technologies that were developed that helped us massively in the decades after the war. Many people were at work and the whole economy changed. So I'm not proposing war as a solution, but let's say a war on climate change in tackling this challenge that's facing all of us on this very little planet, and work together amongst ourselves, work together internationally, work together between government and business. I believe that we can create really beautiful things by facing this threat and tackling it. Thanks.
Thank you, Alexander. Very well said. So in order to tackle climate change, there's many sectors we have to look at. There's obviously the power generation sector, there's home heating, there's industry, as Stephen mentioned, with cement and other types of industrial emissions. But according to drawdown.org, which is a site that collects the thoughts of 200 scientists about what we need to tackle best and what the most effective solutions are, in the top 10, at least 4 of them and maybe 5 involve food and agriculture. And so food waste is one of the big ones. Another one is agricultural practices, and another is deforestation. So I'd love to hear whichever of you would like to talk first about what changes we need in the agricultural and food sector in order to further decarbonization. Anyone want to step up, or should I call on one of you? Stephen, how about you?
Well, all right, if you want me to give it a whirl. The problem is I always say that environmental issues divide into 2 types, romance and sludge. Romance is trees and rocks and grizzly bears and bunnies and all the rest of that. And sludge is the other side, air pollution, toxic waste, energy. I'm a sludge guy, which means I'm really weak on food. I mostly just consume it. I've always wanted to get into lots of biomass questions involved in this and do the math, because that's what I love to do on these subjects, and never had the time to do it very thoroughly. One of the trade-offs, but it's a wider controversy than just what we're talking about here on carbon emissions, is the trade-off is, do you have intensive modern agriculture that has its defects and its critics, right, but uses less land, right? It depends. Everything's location specific. A lot of our sort of locavore organic farming uses more land, and if you want more land for habitat, for forestation, then you want to think hard about the trade-off about intensive agriculture might actually be better on net for the environment and maybe for this problem. But I don't have any sort of numbers to sort of work that through, which is what I always want.
Great. Stephen, Alexander, sorry.
Well, to give you one number, as you had heard on my accent, I'm a Dutchman, right? So I come from this tiny little wet country on the North Sea. It's really small. I would say, I don't know, maybe the size of Maine or New Jersey or so. We are the 2nd food exporter in the world. When our country is densely populated with 70 million people, so in these little plots of land that we have in between, we work so intensively on our agriculture, we produce so much added value that our, our fruit and strawberries and whatever we produce is sold all over the world, and we add some tulips to it as well. So you can really by changing agriculture into more intensive ways, you can really create more valuable food. But there's a few other things related to this. Yes, deforestation is clearly something we should tackle. Since about 2 years now, the 3 main rainforest areas in the world, so let's say the Amazon, Central Africa, and South Asia, have become a net carbon emitter. So whereas these are supposed to be the lungs of the world, and the trees that are there still function like that, there's now so much has been cut that on the kind of peatlands that lay beneath there's now a lot of carbon emitted. It's seen as one of the possible explanations why this little plateau in emissions that we had for a few years in worldwide emissions that were like staying stable, that is rising again in the past 2 years. So working on forests, that is really important to focus on. One last remark here. There's something you can do yourself, and I know in America this message is not very popular, but maybe eat a bit less meat. Eating meat is such an inefficient way to deal with our planet. So let's say if you take steak, 1 kilo, sorry, I come from your work with kilos. I think it's about a quarter of whatever you use. It's like 2 pounds, right? So a kilo of meat takes something like, I think, 10,000 liters of water to produce. But more importantly, the energy that you first put into a cow compared to the energy that you get when you eat a cow is about 35 times as much. So worldwide, there's an area the size of South America that we only use to produce food that we're first going to feed to animals, and after that we eat those animals. While I'm at this topic, the animals don't like this system very much. And think about your own health. It's just proven all over again, recently again by a big meta study. It is just better for your health not to eat meat. So these are 3 good arguments. The animals will be happy if you listen to what I just said. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Alexander. And
Well, here's where the battle may ensue, because my host just made me a steak sandwich for breakfast, and I actually liked it. So, but the other aspect of the agriculture picture, which really goes in even a broader element, is the transportation element of agriculture, and then transportation in general. Because in addition to the electricity sector, obviously transportation is a major player in this. And Steve mentioned that electrifying everything would be one of the best things. How do you get from where we are on the transportation side and also on the big box power plants? You've got a lot of possibilities, and given that our conversation is innovation, I would argue that based on a lot of our reporting, my reporting, if we looked at what the real pressures are, they're not. A lot of these they're not technological. They're policy, and I said on a panel yesterday, it all boils down to who pays and who gets paid. More than technology, more than a lot of these arguments that are being had. You have a nuclear engineer who wants to make sure that she has a job, and you have a sector of our society that. They went to school to get a degree, and it's in nuclear engineering, and suddenly you're going to take away all the nuclear plants. But then some of that has to do more with just the pure economics. It doesn't work, particularly in the States, whereas a place like China that's building 12 reactors, the country is doing it. we don't approach it that way. So it becomes this huge question of how do you fund these things? So on all of these issues, how do we reduce the amount of energy that we're using? And the other soapbox that I've been on these panels is, the question about energy efficiency. How do we manage better what it is that we're using? Because at the point of, at the economic crisis, that was a high point of electricity usage in the country, and we saw, because we had to tighten our belts and some policy changes, we saw more efficient use of appliances and approaches to using our electricity. How can we manage these things better across all sectors, in agriculture, in transportation, in electricity? Some of the innovation doesn't just have to be, how do we, in Elon Musk style, send everyone to Mars. Some of the innovation may be, how do we look at what's in front of our faces and do this better?
Great. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we have a whole bunch of questions from the audience that I'm going to try and summarize and ask. I want to follow up on the regulatory piece, because energy and national power have always been tightly related. Sources of energy have been a way that nations have, evolved their economy as well as evolved their national power to project power. And so what do each of you believe are the single most important regulatory tools, whether they're incentives, whether they're restrictions, whether it's carbon pricing? What policies do each of you think are the most important policies for nations to implement in order to decarbonize? Alex, why don't we start with you on that?
Again, I'm not going to be popular with this one, but in an ideal world, if you want to tackle climate change, you should start at the source. And the climate change is practically fully man-made. The main contributor, there's more like cement and deforestation, but the main contributor is the burning of fossil fuels. Because it's mainly, not only CO2 that's creating this greenhouse gas. So the first thing to tackle would be stop pumping oil and gas and getting coal out of the ground. Every country in the world, even the most progressive ones, let's take a country like Norway, they pump oil out of the ground, they sell it, it's burned somewhere else, and then with the profits, they do incredibly green things. They try to protect their country in all kinds of ways against the effect of climate change. But it's a bit silly. I mean, we should actually, if we could get all hands together in the world, we should say we should get less oil out of the ground. On all the oil companies in the world, if you look at how much reserves they have in the books, the reserves that are defined in a way that they are willing to pump them up in the years to come, there is 5 times as much carbon in there than the amount that we can pump up to keep the world at 2 degrees, which is actually already too much. It should be 1.5 degrees centigrade. So basically 80% of the value of these companies is kind of fake, because if they do pump it up, we're all going to die. So that system doesn't work. To make one comparison here, let's talk about gun control. I mean, practically all countries in the world have strict measures on gun control. In the Netherlands, I just wouldn't know how I could ever get a gun. I have no idea. I would have to travel abroad and smuggle it in maybe. There you control something at the source. If there are no guns available, you have much less problems to work on later. You need less doctors and police, and you don't need these gates at every high school to control whether people will bring in guns. Compared to America, where you have a massive problem, they're freely available, and it has a lot of impact, and then people are afterwards dealing with the impact. Now, although with most countries in the world do what I believe is the right thing with gun control, I can't think of one country in the world, maybe Bhutan or Costa Rica or so, but practically no country in the world is doing the right thing and just leaving it in the ground. So ideally, that would be my proposal. But yeah, being a diplomat, having worked in government, I know this is not the easy solution. So I'm sure that we'll get to much easier solutions on the left side of me,
Yeah,
or the right side.
Stephen,
So,
how about regulation? What do you think is the most effective government policies to reduce climate change?
Well, okay, I do have to say this, though, about Alexander. If you left it in the ground, how would you fly here? That's a rhetorical question, understand. So look, I'm a deregulator. I have a couple of sort of rifle shot ideas about performance standards and also the logic of a carbon tax under certain circumstances. They take a while to play out. Instead, ponder this about regulation. In 2009, Congress, when Obama came in, the House passed, but the Senate didn't pass an emissions trading bill, the Waxman-Markey bill, and it died. And then Obama, years later, came up with a clean power plan that essentially nationalized electric utility industries. Okay, so the Waxman-Markey bill had an interim target for 2020 emissions. Bill didn't pass. Guess what? We've already beaten that target for emissions reductions without a regulatory plan. How did that happen? Well, it happened from something that nobody saw coming. And it was the fracking revolution, which a lot of you here don't like, but that allowed the price of gas to get so low that it's outcompeted coal. The marketplace did that, not a government regulation. Now, there's very sharp limits to that. We're going to meet them pretty soon. But I think that rather than regulation, I've written a lot about this, much more, we're actually pathetic at how little we spend on basic energy research in this country. We have these research labs. There's a good one here in Boulder. And they do some really interesting work, but you know, it's amazing how little we spend. And so, you know, gosh, 10 years ago now, I joined up with a bunch of environmentalists saying we need a much larger research budget for basic energy technologies, because a lot of what we have now is severely limited, like wind and solar, I think, for example. I can go on about all that. But.
Great. You want to say something about this, Ivan?
Policy, though, also helps us to manage with particularly the incentives of the energy producers and providers. And I know Stephen's the conservative, but
The mean, nasty, horrible human being, as I always advertise myself. Yes.
But we incentivize. Especially if you look at utilities, we, in general, all across the country, we incentivize them to build. And they do. So we have excess capacity on our transmission lines, excess capacity in our power plants. We have excess capacity in gas pipelines. So take for instance in Florida, the natural gas pipeline. There was excess capacity that was not being used, because there's a difference between the capacity that's flowing through the pipe and the capacity that is contracted on the pipe. And so the argument was being made that, well, the pipeline's 100% contracted. Okay, that's fine, but how much gas is actually flowing through those pipes? And what I saw in the numbers that you can look up on the Energy Information Administration at the time, about 5 or 6 years ago, was that it was only 65, at a high peak moment, 85% of the capacity. But in general, it was, there was still a third of the capacity of the pipeline that was available. But because it was 100% contracted, the state of Florida approved a brand new pipeline because we need to have more capacity. And that wasn't exactly what the problem was. And then the power sector was running at points in Florida, and if you look, and I wrote about it in California as well, where at some points you had 30, 40, almost 50% excess capacity on the power grid in the winter, and 25, 30% excess capacity in the summer. And it's caused a lot of power plants, particularly the fossil fuel ones, to not be able to compete on the market, and they're going bankrupt. But with the right incentives, if policy-wise, because we're policy-wise, we're incentivizing them one way or the other. And so the question is, how do you choose, and whatever that policy is, I mean, that's up to the American people, but whatever the policy is, some way, shape, or form, we are incentivizing industry to do something.
You know, perverse incentives is actually the superpower of American government, right? I'll just say that.
Okay, with that, we have 30 questions, so we will not have time to ask all 30 questions, but thank you in the audience for coming up with these. I'm going to start with a student question, and I'll let you interpret it. I'm just going to read it. Have we passed the tipping point? There are probably only 20 years before we hit the problem hard, yet the world has done little and the innovations are very small and don't begin to really weigh against the increase in global heating. And I think the question here is there going to be a runaway effect in climate? And who would like to take this? Alex?
The problem with tipping points is that you only know afterwards that you have passed it. So it's not that there's just like one tipping point that we are in a runaway climate change, but it's a lot of them. For those that don't follow tipping points on a daily basis, to give one well-known example, if the Arctic is melting, then the permafrost is also melting, the permanently frozen ground. And there's a lot of carbon stored underneath, including methane, which is a very, very potent greenhouse gas. So then the methane is released, that increases the greenhouse gas effect and the heating, and therefore more permafrost is melting. So that's a positive feedback loop, which is a very negative thing. And there's many of these kind of tipping points. The fear is that you get runaway climate change, that we pass these kind of tipping points, that even if we would someday say from tomorrow onwards we would not burn any fossil fuel anymore worldwide, that still the climate change is increasing and we can't stop it anymore. We know that there is, if you would stop tomorrow, even without a tipping point, that we first get a bit more heating. It's about between 0.5 and 0.7 degrees centigrade. I guess that's about 1 Fahrenheit. I'm not sure. I don't know your Fahrenheit very much. But you still get a bit more heating before it will very slowly cool down again. So that's already there. So this tipping point is maybe the most scary story that you can't go back. Have we passed them already? Well, once long before we accepted in 2009 in Copenhagen the 2 degrees as a limit. Later it was put down a little bit more in Paris. But then scientists said that you have about a 50% chance at runaway climate change if you get above 2 degrees. And strangely, then people said, so then that should be the limit. So compare this, that you're sitting in an airplane and at takeoff the pilot tells you, well, don't worry, you know, we got a 50% chance that we're going to make it today. That is what we have set for ourselves as our target. Later we lowered it a little bit to 1.5. So have we passed them already? We just don't know. Are we going to pass them if we continue the way that we're burning fossil fuels now, increasing emissions with 2 or 3% every year? You can be pretty sure we're going to do it, and it's going to be very hot and nasty on this planet. And it's good that this question comes from the young people, because it is their future. They are right to be very worried. And what gives me hope is to see only 2 weeks ago 1.5 million students worldwide going out in the streets in a movement that had started by just one girl, Greta Thunberg, only 9 months before. That is, in 9 months, the birth of a worldwide movement of young people that are telling my generation that we should act. And that's a very good, positive thing. Thanks.
Thank you, Alexander. Stephen?
Yeah, the problem is I don't actually have much to say about this, because I need to say a lot about it, and I don't actually want to, because it's actually away from the topic on energy and climate innovation. This is actually, I think, a huge blunder in all this. Is we want to go back to the scientific argument to the neglect of the policy argument. I'll just say this. I used to read through the IPCC reports when they came out. They're like 3,000 pages long, a lot to get through. So I quit doing that when I realized that that debate actually doesn't matter in a larger sense. If you say the tipping point's coming tomorrow, how does that make solar power suddenly effective? It doesn't, right? So, sorry, I'm just sort of frustrated with the debate because we're re-arguing things from 20, 30 years ago.
So I guess I would just mention that this comes from a student, as Alexander said, and they're concerned about the answer to the question as an existential question. And so I asked the question not because it's about climate innovation, but we had several that were focused on this. And now back to innovation. A couple questions have come in about air capture and direct carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. And that technology obviously exists, it's obviously expensive, but I'd love to hear thoughts from the panelists on what some practical issues with air capture are, not from the capture perspective, but say, what do you do with the carbon dioxide once it's captured? Ivan?
There are a variety of things that are being worked on, including things at power plants and all, but innovative-wise, so you look at a place like Orlando, and one of the things that they're doing there is testing out using algae as a way to capture carbon. So once again, one of the things that I keep harping on is this question of what types of things are in front of our faces that can work. So their answer to part of that question is, well, we're going to use algae, and they're finding that it is helping to capture carbon.
Oh, yeah, so right, lots of problems with it, including, where would you store that much? Whether you do carbon capture and sequestration from a coal-fired power plant, which we've been trying to do for 15 years now, and it's also not going well, to whether the problem with sort of sucking out of the air through various catalytic means is that it turns out to be a very energy-intensive thing to do. So you say, fine, we'll use windmills and solar panels to do it, except we want to use those electrons to, do a storage battery in California for the grid or do pump storage. You can only use those electrons from a windmill or a solar panel for one thing, and we want to use them for everything. So there's that problem. I think this needs a lot more work. That's a great research question to see if you can get it down in some economically efficient and scalable way. There's one other that I mentioned that's related to this. And it's one I'm not very fond of, but I think it needs research and serious thought, and it goes either by the banner of solar radiation management or geoengineering. And it's a long story. When this was originally proposed almost 20 years ago, that we actually know from the science of the Mount Pinatubo eruption way back in 1992, whenever that was, really great data from that eruption, because it was the first major volcanic eruption with all our satellites that do all this great stuff. And, you've done the calculations about could you put a certain amount of sulfur dioxide, sulfur particulates high in the atmosphere that would deflect some radiation and lower the Earth's temperature. There's huge problems with it. But of course, a guy like Elon Musk might decide someday, well, I'll just do that. It's a perfect Bond villain scenario, by the way. But when it was originally proposed, the sort of climate policy community and environmental community really hated it. And now the IPCC is saying, yeah, we maybe need to have that as an emergency backup measure. By the way, one of the leading advocates for this view is the fellow here at NCAR, whose name, Widgley, Tom Widgley, here in Boulder at NCAR, has been saying for a long time now that we need to look into this in a serious way. So right here, one of your neighbors.
Alexander?
Well, I agree on with Stephen, and that's not on everything, as Stephen knows, but more research in the issue of capturing the carbon, yes, I fully support that. We need it. Where we are now is that these kind of technologies are basically still on the drawing table. They've been proven to work on a very small scale. Let's say if you have a factory and as soon as the CO2 is leaving the smokestacks, if you capture it then, it costs you about a third of the energy that you're using for the whole process. So you make it much more inefficient, but you do capture the carbon. It's, of course, makes much more sense to avoid that the carbon comes in the air in the first place. So efficiency, whatever, at home take an LED light instead of a traditional light. All those kind of measures add up if you do that worldwide, both in industries and in houses. Try to use less energy. Capturing carbon, the most advanced technology that we actually have for it is a tree. You may have it in your garden. That is the best technology we have to capture carbon at the moment. So, yeah, lots of room for stimulating innovation because we just need all hands on deck. We need all possible solutions. So, I'll leave it at that.
So another question I'm going to summarize from a few different questions has to do with two things, that this is a global problem, so requires international cooperation, but at the same time there are developing countries that are very dependent on fossil fuels who have less means to be able to take the new technologies to market. So the question fundamentally is global collaboration possible considering how bad the political international tensions are?
Well, all right, I'm going to throw down on this one because it's one I've thought about a lot. It's a huge collective action problem, irregardless of basic tensions and traditional frictions in the world. We've seen that from the beginning. But this is an important point that always gets left behind or shoved aside. So this is old news now. The original Kyoto Protocol, which was a huge mistake, but understandable why they thought that way. And that's a long story about diplomacy that's interesting, about why they picked that model. But the model was, one part of it was, the rich countries go first, the poor countries come along later. That's been our model for trade, previous environmental treaties, and so forth. And the problem is that, remember, the US Senate voted, 95 to 0 in 1996, 97, because they were afraid that an asymmetrical treaty that allowed China and India to continue to grow and the United States was going to spend a lot of money to reduce emissions was going to lead to the kind of trade problems that gave us Trump, right? So, Al Gore flies off to Kyoto at the last minute and asks China and India, would you at least agree to commit to emissions reductions in the second commitment period that starts now? We're at the end of the first Kyoto commitment period. And the Chinese said to Gore, I know this from State Department people, career State Department people in the room, we don't understand you Americans. You expect us to be poor forever? And the Indians were even more blunt. They said to Vice President Gore, you guys got rich on fossil fuels, and now it's our turn. When we're as rich as you, then we'll talk about emissions reductions. And that same calculation goes for every developing country in the world, and that has not fundamentally changed in 20 years. So, my one sentence, this is where it gets tricky with the carbon tax thing that you need to try and harmonize on a global level. I'm not talking all about that, but what we need are cheap, scalable energy solutions that a developing country can adopt to scale up their standard of living. In other words, you want energy solutions that are cheaper than coal and gas in particular, and that's the hard thing to do. I think we'd be best off if we admitted we do not know how to do that, because we don't.
Ivan?
Well, sort of one of the troubles becomes that even as the transition occurs in the United States to more carbon-free sources, the energy industry is looking increasingly to export all of that shale gas that we've now developed to other countries, building more liquid natural gas export facilities around on the coast, so that we can send it to other countries. So that's not helping us on our carbon reduction. We're just shifting it to another place. So it's not even necessarily just cooperation with other countries. It's what we end up doing just as Americans in terms of what we deliver in other parts of the world. And so while we're making a transition to wind and solar and storage, the net effect is negligible, if not absent entirely.
I
Alexander?
think we're in a kind of perfect storm. You need. So on the one hand, we have climate change. It is, for the first time in mankind, an existential threat to all of us, and it's urgent. We talk about decades. To solve that, you need good governance. And the governance in the world is actually not so good at this moment. We are becoming more We want to build walls. We want to close down our international cooperation. You see everywhere people want to go back to the old days. People become more nationalistic, kind of shutting off from the problem and just close your eyes and hope that it goes away. Those two of them are interrelated, and I would love to turn it around, that we would say, well, we need more international cooperation, because this is a problem that affects all of us. The world is globalized, and the environmental problems that used to be, when I was young, environmental problems were local. You know, it was like polluted ground, etc. But now the environmental problems are globalized as well. So we have to solve it all together. I think there was a brief interval a couple of years ago in late 2015 when suddenly there were a lot of international agreements, and two of them that are interesting in this field is the Sustainable Development Goals, where all countries in the world agreed that there's a whole list of 17 really important goals that we have to work on. It was split out in 169 different targets. That is about on food and on water and on poverty, etc. One of them is on climate, and in the same, just a few months later, in the same year, 2015, we agreed on the Paris Agreement, where for the first time after the failures of first Kyoto and then Copenhagen, practically all countries in the world agreed on tackling climate change. Much less binding than we had originally intended. That didn't work. It worked for the EU, by the way. The US voted 95-0 against in the Senate, but the EU countries did agree. And that comes back to the question Steve was just talking about. A lot of things are unequal in the world, so there's a lot of unfairness as well. But the way that I see it is that it were the rich countries that for 200 years have been pumping CO2 in the air. There's now a second group of countries, let's say the China kind of countries, that for a long time didn't contribute, but are now contributing more than we do. And there's a third group of countries, take whatever, a country like Niger or something in the Sahel, that never ever in their life contributed anything apart from maybe burning a little bit of wood somewhere, which doesn't count. And the most unfair thing of all is that these countries in this third group, they get the worst of climate change. It first appears in its worst form, especially in those vulnerable countries, and then on top of that, they are less capable than we in the West are in adapting to these new challenges. So I feel that there is a moral obligation to help those countries. Now, as the last thing on technology, you see that solar panels are rapidly accepted. You see in many countries that in countries that are developing, that they just skip this phase of fossil fuels, and they sometimes go immediately from wood burning to solar panels. An interesting example, not from the group that I just mentioned, because they are already rich, is the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi. They have now massively invested in solar panels. Well, Abu Dhabi is literally on top of the oil. I mean, they don't even have to transport it. It just pops up. So if they invest in solar panels, there must be something interesting happening. And as a very last example that I mentioned yesterday in a speech, in Kentucky, there's the Coal Museum. Do you know where they get their electricity from? Right, solar panels. Thanks.
Okay. Awesome. So we have 7 minutes left on the panel, and I want to talk about the intersection of the economy and the global climate situation and hear what you think about it. So we've heard mentioned the stranded assets problem. There's enough fossil fuel resources to raise the temperature of the planet many degrees, 6, 7 degrees. So fundamentally, to solve this, that resource has to be left in the ground, which means private interests are going to lose a lot of money, trillions of dollars of stranded assets. So this is a government, private industry, physics, chemistry problem, and there's only a few ways you can think of to solve that. So I'll just go down the line here, and this can serve as your closing statement as well, but it implicates the Green New Deal that we're hearing about, because that's the intersection between private industry, government, and regulatory and climate. So talk about stranded assets and then give a quick closing summation.
One of the biggest concerns that everyone has is, well, so how do we get there quickly and still keep the lights on, still keep our cars running? So power plants, as you see it in various places all over the country, are going bankrupt, particularly fossil fuel plants, because solar and wind are coming in cheaper than the nat gas, coal, nuclear. I'll answer the question this way. Steve mentioned about still the need for big box power plants. That's going to require us to raise rates, which continue to rise, have been rising steadily for a very long time. If we have policies that incentivize more my neighbor going ahead and putting a solar panel and a solar panel on his or her rooftop, a battery in their garage, I'm not paying for that solar panel and that battery. The utility industry will argue that, well, you're cost shifting to the disadvantaged, the poor, but there's another element to that. In our bills and in our taxes, we already subsidize the disadvantaged on their electric bills. So take them out of the equation. Put community solar and storage to resolve issues with the disadvantaged. What does that do to the power plants? They're already going bankrupt. They're already becoming stranded assets. If you incentivize the utilities to be energy efficient instead of incentivizing them on the capital side of construction, including transmission, you also have an impact in the effects of climate change, of significant wildfires from transmission and electrical, yada, yada, yada. Finding other ways to incentivize is a critical piece.
Thank you. Stephen?
Yeah, so I think we had the time I'd want to dispute Ivan a bit from an odd point of view, which is I hate the electric utilities. They're all a bunch of corporate socialists and have been for a century. And I never shed a tear when they go bankrupt. But there's more to that story. I think there's some problems with the way you frame it all. But that would be fun. But instead, I'm going to ruin everybody's day. I love doing this. Some of the technological improvements that I like to hope for, I'll talk about one in a minute, are going to come from ExxonMobil. So I say I like to ruin people's day. By the way, ExxonMobil has been on record in favor of a carbon tax for 15 years, which nobody seems to know. But they've also put almost $1 billion so far into research on algae biofuel. And that's an interesting subject. I've been to their briefings with Craig Venters, their partner, the genomics guy. I have a good friend of mine who's a venture capitalist who's put a lot of money into an Israeli startup venture on algae biofuels. And that, if we could actually crack that one, that will change things so fast. I'm not a biochemist. I've talked to some who tell me the problems with it. And, again, we've got some early laboratory experiments to prove that can be done as a chemical process, but the problem's always cost and scale. But, you've got some private companies doing it. And look, one historical example I like to think about is it's not literally true, or it's an overstatement to say that John D. Rockefeller saved the whales, but it's partly true because, his rapid expansion of oil production and refining, the price of kerosene falls dramatically, and we quit using whale oil and other kinds of oils in our lamps in the late 19th century. And that same dynamic can take place. It's similar to the one I mentioned earlier about how suddenly abundant and cheap natural gas. I don't know if you know that. Remember, the natural gas was $14, $15 a 1,000 cubic feet just 15 years ago. Now it struggles to get up to 3. And this is, we were all those LNG terminals that were coming online now, we were building those 15 years ago to import gas. Now we have so much we're exporting it, right? Okay, so totally reasonable points about the global impact of all that, but that's how quickly things can change when you actually come up with something that works.
Great. Alexander, you get the last word, and you got 2 minutes.
I guess those 2 minutes will go to ExxonMobil, because I don't see ExxonMobil as some kind of humanitarian institution that's going to save the world.
Good, I'm glad I ruined your day.
No, and I won't ruin yours. Let me say a few things about ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil had in the 1970s the best experts in the world about climate change. And they informed the board of governance or whatever, the way they organized it. The top of ExxonMobil was informed about climate change. If you pump too much oil, if you burn too much of it, we're going to ruin the climate and the planet is going to be impossible to live here. Instead of releasing that information, they not only decided to keep it silent, they actually started an active campaign where they put in millions and millions for decades to create confusion in society, as if the scientists did not yet agree. I would think this is criminal behavior. Suppose you are an engineer and you know something about a bridge and you know that the bridge is going to collapse if there's too many people on it. Would you actively direct more cars and people to that bridge to see that it's going to collapse? You'd be called to court and you would be thrown in jail if you do that. So this information is out. It's not been in a court yet, so I'm not allowed to judge here. I am not a judge. But the behavior of the major fossil fuels industries on climate change, I think, is absolutely terrible. I want to end with a more positive note. The Green New Deal was just mentioned by Ivan. I think that is exactly an example of the kind of policies where you need, because the solution is complex. It is a combination of governance, it is a combination of the economy, it is something where everybody should be on board, and it also recognizes that if you change the economy to a new kind of greener economy, that it also has all kinds of other positive effects on the whole society at large. And that is something, if all of us would embrace that and work together on it, we can actually save this planet. This planet is beautiful. You live in what I believe is the most beautiful state of the United States, and I had the pleasure to be here 3 times in 1 year, and I've seen quite a bit of your state. It is so beautiful. Try to preserve it. Try to preserve your glaciers and the nature and the biodiversity as it is. And you're here in Boulder in such a wonderful place where you can enjoy so much nature. Try to keep it as it is, and for that you need to write policies. And one way to influence it is to vote. Vote for a party that recognizes science and that does come with the right measures. Thanks.
So climate change is a wicked problem. Let's thank our panelists, Ivan, Stephen, and Alexander, for helping us think about it.